Repeat exactly what you just heard, the billionaire said, his voice low, controlled, but something in his eyes had already changed. 20 minutes earlier, Jonathan Reed hadn't even looked at her. The restaurant shimmered in quiet luxury, crystal glasses catching the soft amber light, the muted hum of conversations floating like background music. Jonathan sat at the center table, a $40,000 watch resting against the edge of imported marble, his attention fixed on a deal worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Across from him, two foreign investors spoke in a dialect so rare even the hired interpreter hesitated, nodding politely, missing pieces he didn't dare admit he didn't understand. Emily Carter stood nearby, pen in hand, posture still, invisible in the way only service staff are trained to be. She had been on her feet for 8 hours. Her uniform was simple, black, clean, forgettable, just the way the world preferred her. Jonathan exhaled, impatient. "Can we move this along?" he said, not looking up. The interpreter stumbled through another partial translation, smoothing over words he couldn't quite catch. The investors exchanged a glance. A subtle one. Almost nothing. Almost everything. Emily noticed. She always noticed. She didn't interrupt. Not yet. Her eyes shifted, just once, from the table to the reflection in the polished glass behind them. Lips moving. Tone tightening. A phrase repeated twice. That was enough. She stepped forward, placing a glass of water gently beside Jonathan's hand. No sudden movement. No disruption. Just timing. "Sir," she said softly, almost as if asking about his order. Jonathan didn't respond. He wasn't used to being addressed by someone like her unless it involved a menu. She waited half a second. Then she leaned in just enough for only him to hear. One sentence. That was all it took. His fingers stopped moving. The room didn't change. The light didn't flicker. The conversations didn't pause. But Jonathan Reed did. Slowly, he lifted his head. For the first time, he looked directly at her. Not through her. Not past her. At her. "What did you just say?" His voice was quieter now. Sharper. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't repeat it immediately. She simply met his gaze, calm, steady, unreadable. At the table, one of the investors shifted in his seat. The interpreter blinked, confused. Jonathan pushed his chair back. Not loudly, but enough. The legs brushed against the marble floor with a soft scrape that somehow cut through the entire room. He stood. People noticed now, not because of noise, but because of him. Men like Jonathan Reed didn't stand unless something mattered. His eyes never left Emily. Say it again. Around them, silence began to gather. Not complete, not obvious, but creeping, curious. The kind of silence that forms when something unseen has already changed. Emily spoke. This time, just loud enough for the table. The interpreter's face went blank. One investor's smile disappeared. The other leaned back, arms crossing slowly. Jonathan didn't move, didn't blink, because the sentence she had spoken wasn't just a translation. It was a warning. And in that moment, the most powerful man in the room realized the only person who had actually understood what was being said was the one no one had been listening to. No one spoke for 3 full seconds, and in a room built on power and control, 3 seconds felt like a fracture. Jonathan Reed slowly turned his head toward the investors, his expression no longer impatient but precise, calculated, as if every word now carried weight he had not noticed before. "Is that accurate?" he asked, his tone calm, but the calm of a man who had already begun to rearrange the outcome in his mind. The interpreter hesitated, flipping through his notes, his confidence slipping in small, visible cracks. "I may need clarification on that phrase," he admitted, his voice tightening. One of the investors leaned forward, offering a smooth smile that did not reach his eyes. "There may have been a misunderstanding," he said, choosing each word carefully, as if stepping across thin ice. Jonathan did not respond immediately. He simply looked back at Emily. Not at her uniform, not at the tray in her hand. At her. "Translated again," he said. Emily did not rush. She did not look at the investors. She did not look at the interpreter. She spoke as if she had already decided the truth mattered more than the room. The sentence came out steady, clear, without hesitation. This time, there was no room for interpretation. The air shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. The second investor leaned back, exhaling through his nose, his posture no longer relaxed. The first adjusted his cufflinks, buying time. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign that something deeper had just locked into place. You said the clause was standard, he said, now addressing the investors directly. That it protected both sides. A pause. No one answered immediately. Emily stepped back, returning to her position as if nothing had happened, as if she had simply delivered water and not altered the direction of a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Jonathan was no longer the same man who had ignored her minutes ago. He reached for the contract, flipping to the page in question, his eyes scanning with a new intensity, connecting what he had heard with what was written. And suddenly, it was there. Not obvious, not bold, but there, hidden in phrasing designed to pass unnoticed unless someone knew exactly what to listen for. His fingers stopped on the line. He let out a slow breath. Interesting, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The interpreter shifted again, now silent, aware that he had missed something critical. Around the table, the confidence that had filled the room earlier began to thin, replaced by something quieter. Caution. Jonathan closed the folder gently, aligning the edges with deliberate care. Then he looked up. We are going to pause this discussion, he said. Not loud, not aggressive. Final. One of the investors opened his mouth, then closed it again, reading the shift in tone. This was no longer negotiation. This was evaluation. Jonathan stood still for a moment longer, then turned slightly toward Emily. How long have you been working here? He asked. The question landed softly, but it carried more weight than any number he had discussed that afternoon. Emily met his gaze for just a second. Long enough, she said quietly. No explanation. No apology. Just the truth, delivered the same way she had delivered everything else. Jonathan nodded once, as if filing that answer away with everything else he had just learned. Because for the first time in a long time, he realized something he did not like admitting. He had walked into the room believing he controlled every variable. And he had been wrong. The investors gathered their documents with controlled movements, the kind that tried to preserve dignity even as leverage quietly slipped away. And within minutes the table that had once held authority now felt like a stage after the performance had ended. Jonathan Reed remained standing for a moment longer, watching them leave, not with anger but with a sharpened awareness, as if the world had just revealed a detail he had overlooked for years. When the last of them disappeared past the glass doors, the room slowly exhaled, conversations returning in cautious waves, silverware clinking again. But something had shifted, and everyone could feel it without understanding why. Jonathan did not sit back down. Instead, he turned fully toward Emily, who had already resumed her work, refilling a glass at a nearby table with the same quiet precision, as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Emily, he said, reading her name from the small tag pinned neatly to her uniform. She paused, just slightly, then walked back to his table. Not rushed, not hesitant, balanced. Yes, sir, she replied, her tone steady, professional, unchanged. Jonathan studied her for a second, longer than most people would consider polite, but not long enough to be intrusive. He was measuring something he could not yet define. Sit, he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. It was not a command, not quite a request either. Emily glanced briefly toward the dining room, where other tables waited, where expectations remained. I am on shift, she said simply. Jonathan nodded once, accepting the boundary without resistance, something he rarely did. Then stand, he replied, adjusting without losing focus. There was no tension in his voice now, only curiosity. Where did you learn that dialect? The question hung between them, quiet but direct. Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved once toward the polished glass behind him, catching reflections, movement, distance. Then back to him. From someone who needed me to understand it, she said. Not defensive, not revealing, just enough. Jonathan leaned back slightly, processing the answer, recognizing its shape even if he did not yet see its full outline. That was not just language, he said. That was structure, intent. Emily gave the smallest nod. Words carry both, she replied. A pause followed. Not awkward, not empty, just space. The kind that allows truth to settle without being forced. Jonathan rested his hands lightly on the table, fingers aligned, a habit of control that now felt different, less rigid, more deliberate. Do you know what that clause would have done? He asked. Emily's gaze did not shift. Yes, she said. It would have transferred decision rights under a conditional interpretation that most people would not notice until it was too late. Jonathan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. Most people, he repeated. Then he shook his head slightly, as if correcting himself. Most of my team. That landed heavier than anything else he had said. Emily did not react. She did not need to. The truth was already there. He looked at her again, this time without the filter of assumption, without the quiet hierarchy that had shaped every interaction he had in rooms like this. You are not just working here, he said. It was not a question. Emily adjusted the edge of the napkin on the table, aligning it perfectly with the plate, a small act that carried more intention than it seemed. I am working here, she replied. Nothing more, nothing less. Jonathan watched that gesture, that precision, that restraint, and for the first time, he understood something that had nothing to do with contracts or negotiations. Some people did not reveal who they were because they had nothing to prove. They revealed it only when it mattered. He stood there, silent for a moment, then reached into his jacket and placed a card on the table. Not pushed, not offered aggressively, just placed. If you ever decide you are done being invisible, he said, his voice calm, call me. Emily looked at the card, then back at him. No surprise. No excitement, just recognition. Visibility is not always the goal, she said quietly. Jonathan held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, the kind that carried respect instead of authority. And as he turned to leave, for the first time that evening, he was not thinking about the deal he had just walked away from. He was thinking about the one person in the room who had never needed it. Jonathan stepped out into the cool evening air, the glass doors closing quietly behind him. But the silence followed him, lingering in a way he was not used to. The city moved as it always did, headlights passing in smooth lines, distant horns blending into a constant rhythm. But his mind was no longer on the schedule waiting on his phone or the meetings stacked for the next morning. It stayed behind, at a small table, with a single sentence spoken by someone he had nearly ignored. His driver opened the door of the car, but Jonathan did not get in immediately. He stood there for a moment, looking at his reflection in the dark window, his own expression unfamiliar, not uncertain, but interrupted. Sir, the driver asked gently. Jonathan blinked once, then nodded and slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away, the city lights stretched across the glass, and for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone. Instead, he replayed the moment. Not the deal, not the loss, the precision, the timing, the way she had waited until it mattered. Back inside the restaurant, Emily Carter cleared the table Jonathan had left behind, her movement steady, unhurried, the same as always. The card remained where he had placed it. She looked at it briefly, just long enough to read the name again, then picked it up and slipped it into the small pocket of her apron without expression. Another table called her name. Another order. Another set of expectations that required nothing more than efficiency and a quiet presence. She moved between tables with practiced ease, her voice soft, her steps measured, her attention divided but never scattered. To everyone else, the night continued exactly as it should. Orders placed, plates delivered, bills signed. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth remembering. But at table 14, a man who had watched the earlier scene leaned slightly toward his companion and whispered something under his breath, eyes following Emily as she walked past. Not curiosity. Recognition. It spread slowly, not loudly, like a thought that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Emily did not notice, or if she did not show it. She refilled a glass, adjusted a fork, aligned a plate by less than half an inch, details that most people would never see but that defined the way she moved through the world. Precision was not something she turned on. It was something she never turned off. In the kitchen, a younger server approached her, lowering her voice. What did you say to him? She asked, half curious, half amazed. Emily paused for just a fraction of a second, then continued stacking plates. The truth, she said simply. The server frowned slightly, waiting for more, but nothing came. Emily did not explain. She never did. Hours passed. The dinner rush softened into a steady flow, then into quiet pockets of space between tables. Outside, the city shifted into night. Inside, the lights dimmed just enough to make everything feel slower, calmer. Near closing, Emily returned to the back hallway, the one place where the noise did not reach, where the polished surfaces gave way to plain walls and soft shadows. She reached into her apron and took out the card. Jonathan Reed, a name that carried weight in rooms she had never entered and never tried to. She turned it once between her fingers, then placed it carefully inside her bag, not as a decision, not as a commitment, but as something not yet finished. Because some moments did not end when they happened. They waited. And somewhere across the city, in the quiet of a moving car, Jonathan Reed was beginning to understand that for the first time in a long time, he had not been the one asking the right questions. The city was quieter after midnight, not silent, but softened, as if the edges of everything had been gently blurred, and inside a modest apartment 3 blocks from the subway line, Emily Carter placed her bag on the small wooden table by the door with the same care she gave everything else. The room was simple, clean, nothing unnecessary. A narrow bookshelf lined one wall, filled not with decoration but with worn volumes, pages marked, corners folded, each one holding something she had chosen not to forget. She slipped off her shoes, set them neatly side by side, then reached into her bag and took out the card. Jonathan Reed. The letters were embossed, precise, intentional, the kind of detail that reflected a world built on clarity and control. She turned it once between her fingers, then placed it on the table, not hidden, not displayed, just present. For a moment, she stood still, her eyes resting on it, not with curiosity, but with recognition. Not of him, of what the card represented. A door, one she had seen before, one she had walked through once, years ago, in a different building, under different lights, when her name had been printed on something more than a uniform tag. She moved to the shelf and pulled out a thin folder, its edges slightly worn, its contents carefully kept. Inside were papers that most people would have framed, achievements that had once opened conversations instead of ending them. Certificates, letters, a research draft filled with annotations in her own handwriting, precise and structured, mapping patterns across languages and legal phrasing. She flipped through them slowly, not to remember, but to confirm. The same patterns, the same structures, the same kind of clause she had recognized tonight, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. She closed the folder and returned it to its place. Nothing in her expression changed. Nothing needed to. Across the city, Jonathan Reed sat in his office, the lights still on, the skyline stretching beyond the glass in clean, sharp lines. His jacket rested on the back of his chair, his tie loosened just enough to suggest the day had not ended when it was supposed to. The contract lay open on his desk, the same page marked, the same line circled, not once, but 3 times. He had read it again, and again, not because he did not understand it, but because he could not accept how close it had come to being signed without question. He leaned back slightly, his fingers pressed together, his gaze unfocused, not on the numbers, not on the names, but on a different detail entirely. Timing. She had waited, not rushed, not interrupted. She had spoken at the exact moment it could not be ignored. That was not luck. That was discipline. He reached for his phone, then stopped halfway, his hand hovering for a second before lowering again. Information had never been hard for him to get. But this was not about information. It was about understanding. Back in her apartment, Emily poured a glass of water and sat down at the small table, the card still resting where she had left it. She did not reach for it. She did not avoid it either. She simply let it remain, as if the decision it carried was not urgent. Because for her, it was not. She had already walked away from a world that valued what she knew more than who she was. And tonight had not changed that. It had only reminded her that the world had not changed either. She took a slow sip of water, her eyes steady, her thoughts quiet, not unsettled, not pulled, just aware. Somewhere between the silence of her apartment and the glow of a city that never fully slept, 2 people sat with the same realization, though neither would have said it out loud. Some opportunities arrive loudly, demanding attention. Others arrive quietly, placing themselves in front of you, and waiting to see if you will recognize them. And neither of them had decided yet what this one was. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale light slipping through the narrow window of Emily's apartment, touching the edges of the table where the card still rested exactly where she had left it. Nothing had moved. Not the glass. Not the chair. Not the decision waiting quietly in the center of the room. Emily stood by the sink, tying her hair back with practiced ease, her movements efficient, unhurried, the kind that came from years of doing what needed to be done without pause for hesitation. She glanced once at the clock. 6:40 a.m. Early shift. She reached for her bag, then stopped for a brief second, her eyes shifting toward the card. Not drawn, not avoiding, just acknowledging. Then she picked it up, slid it into the inner pocket of her bag, and walked out. Across the city, Jonathan Reed had not slept much. The skyline outside his office had faded from night into morning, while the lights inside had remained unchanged. A second folder now lay open beside the contract, filled with notes he had asked for just before midnight. Not about the investors, not about the deal, about language patterns, about authorship, about a research framework he had not thought about in years, something his company had acquired quietly, efficiently, absorbed into their systems without ever meeting the person behind it. His assistant stood near the door, tablet in hand, waiting. "The documentation you requested," she said carefully. "It is older than we expected. The original contributor was never formally on board. No follow-up records." Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the page, then stopping. A name, not highlighted, not emphasized, almost lost among the technical entries. Emily Carter. He did not react immediately. He simply leaned back, letting the information settle, not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something he had already begun to suspect. "She wrote this," he said quietly. "Not a question." The assistant hesitated. "It appears so," she replied. Silence followed. Not empty. Measured. Jonathan closed the folder, aligning it with the others on his desk, the same precise movement he always made when something had reached its conclusion. But this was not an ending. It was a beginning he had missed the first time. "Clear my morning," he said. The assistant blinked, surprised. "You have 3 board calls and a clear it," he repeated, calm, final. She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Back at the restaurant, the morning shift moved with a different rhythm. Faster, sharper, less polished, more urgent. Coffee machines hissed. Orders were called out in quick succession, and sunlight replaced the soft glow of the night before. Emily moved through it all without change. Same posture, same precision, same quiet presence. To everyone else, she was exactly what she appeared to be. Reliable, efficient, replaceable. She refilled a cup, placed a plate, stepped back. No hesitation, no distraction. But when the door opened and a familiar figure stepped inside, the shift in the room was immediate, though no one could quite explain why. Jonathan Reed did not look around. He did not check his phone. He walked straight to the counter, his pace steady, his focus fixed. Emily noticed him the same way she noticed everything. Without turning her head, without breaking rhythm, she finished placing the order in front of her table, then turned. Their eyes met again. Not for the first time. Not the same as before. Jonathan stopped a few feet away, close enough now that there was no distance left to hide behind. He did not speak right away. He did not need to. Because this time, he was not here for a deal. He was here for an answer. And Emily already knew that. The space between them was not large, but it held something heavier than distance, something unspoken that neither of them rushed to break. Jonathan Reed stood still, his presence drawing quiet attention from the room, but for once he did not seem to notice it. His focus remained on Emily. Not the uniform, not the role. Her. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, then shifted her attention back to the table beside her, placing a plate down with careful precision before stepping toward him. No hesitation, no performance, just movement. "Good morning," she said, her tone even, professional, unchanged from the night before. Jonathan nodded once. "Good morning." The words felt different coming from him, less automatic, more deliberate. A pause followed. Not awkward, just measured. "You knew," he said finally. Emily tilted her head slightly. "About the clause," he clarified. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a coffee pot nearby, refilling a cup for a customer without looking away for long. Then she returned her attention to him. "I recognized it," she said. Simple, direct. Jonathan studied her, as if trying to understand how someone could reduce something so complex into something so small. "You wrote it," he said. This time, it was not a question. The air shifted again. Not sharply, quietly. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a stillness now, a deeper kind, like a line that had just been crossed without noise. A version of it, she replied. Jonathan exhaled slowly, almost a quiet acknowledgement of a puzzle finally aligning. We acquired that framework 5 years ago, he said. It changed how we evaluate international contracts. Emily nodded once. I know. 2 words. No emphasis. No pride. Just fact. Jonathan's brow tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in realization. And you are here, he said, gesturing lightly to the room around them. The noise, the movement, the constant flow of people who would never notice what stood in front of them. Emily followed his gesture for a brief second, then looked back at him. Yes, she said. Another pause. This one longer. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the space between them. Why? The question was quiet, honest, without assumption. Emily did not answer right away. Her eyes moved once across the room, taking in the small details, the rhythm of work, the quiet order of things that made sense in a way the other world did not. Then she spoke. Because understanding something, she said slowly, is not the same as belonging to it. Jonathan did not interrupt, did not challenge. He simply listened. For once, I understood that world, she continued. The language, the structures, the way people hide intention behind precision. She paused, just for a second. But I did not belong there. Jonathan straightened slightly, absorbing the words, not as a defense, but as a truth he had never considered from that angle. And here, he asked. Emily glanced at the table she had just set, at the cup she had just filled, at the quiet system she moved through without resistance. Here, people say what they want, she said, and what they need. Jonathan's gaze softened, not visibly, but enough that the sharp edge of it eased. He looked around the room for the first time since walking in, seeing not just the setting, but the difference she had pointed to. Then back at her. You saved me from signing that deal, he said. Not as praise, not as gratitude, as fact. Emily met his eyes again. You would have seen it eventually, she said. Jonathan shook his head slightly. Eventually is expensive. That almost earned a reaction. Almost. But Emily remained still, grounded, unchanged. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the same card, placing it on the counter this time, closer, more intentional. I am not offering you a job, he said. Not yet. That was new. Emily glanced at the card, then back at him. Then what are you offering? She asked. Jonathan held her gaze, steady. A conversation, he said. One where you are not invisible. The words settled between them, quiet, but heavy enough to matter. Emily did not pick up the card. Not yet. Because some invitations were not about where they led. They were about whether they deserved to be accepted at all. The card remained on the counter between them, untouched, its edges perfectly aligned with the polished surface, as if even it understood the importance of waiting. Around them, the restaurant continued its rhythm, orders called, cups filled, footsteps moving in quiet patterns, but at that small stretch of space, time slowed just enough to notice what most people missed. Emily looked at the card for a brief second, then lifted her eyes back to Jonathan. Not curious, not impressed, just present. A conversation, she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the words rather than accepting them. Jonathan gave a slight nod. No expectations, he added. No assumptions. That mattered more than he realized. Emily's gaze did not soften, but it shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if something in his tone had aligned with something she recognized. And if I say no? She asked. The question was not confrontational. It was precise. Jonathan did not hesitate. Then nothing changes, he said. You continue exactly as you are. He paused for a fraction of a second. And I continue knowing I almost missed something important. That landed differently. Not as persuasion. Not as pressure. As awareness. Emily studied him for a moment longer. Not his suit. Not his posture, but the absence of something she had expected to find. There was no urgency. No attempt to control the outcome. Just a quiet steadiness that had not been there the night before. Behind her, a voice called out for coffee. Emily turned, refilled the cup, placed it gently on the table, adjusted the handle so it faced the right direction, then stepped back again. Every movement deliberate, every detail considered. When she returned, the card was still there. Jonathan had not moved it, had not pushed it closer, had not repeated himself. That told her more than anything he could have said. She reached forward, not quickly, not slowly, and picked up the card. The motion was simple, but it carried a decision. Not acceptance, not refusal, a step. She turned it once between her fingers, then slipped it into her apron pocket, the same place she had kept it the night before. Jonathan watched, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. That is not a yes, she said quietly. I know, he replied. A faint hint of something almost like a smile touched the corner of his expression, but it did not linger. It is enough. Another pause settled between them, lighter now, less weighted by uncertainty. Emily tilted her head slightly. Where? She asked. Jonathan glanced briefly toward the window, where the city moved beyond the glass, steady and indifferent. Somewhere without a menu, he said. Emily almost smiled. Almost. But instead, she gave a small nod. After my shift, she said. No flourish. No hesitation. Just timing. Jonathan stepped back, creating space again, not retreating, but respecting the boundary she had drawn without needing to say it. I will be there, he said. He did not ask when. He trusted she would decide. And that was new. He turned then, walking toward the door without looking back, not because he was certain, but because he no longer needed to control what happened next. Emily stood for a moment, feeling the weight of the card in her pocket, not heavy, not light, just present. Another order came in. Another table needed attention. She moved again, seamlessly, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not in the room. Not in the noise. In the space between what was offered and what was chosen. And for the first time, that space was not empty. It was intentional. The city felt different in the evening, not quieter, but more honest, as if the layers of the day had been stripped away, leaving only what people chose to carry with them. Emily stepped out of the restaurant just as the last light faded from the glass buildings, her shift finished, her movements no longer bound by the rhythm of orders and expectations. She paused for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting her bag on her shoulder, the card still resting inside, unchanged, but no longer just an object. Across the street, a small cafe sat between two larger buildings, its lights warm, unassuming, the kind of place people passed without noticing. That was why she chose it. Inside, Jonathan Reed was already there. Not at the center. Not by the window. A corner table. No jacket. No tie. Just a man sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone untouched for longer than he would normally allow. When Emily walked in, he looked up immediately, not because he had been waiting impatiently, but because he had been paying attention. She walked toward the table with the same steady pace she carried everywhere, then stopped just long enough to acknowledge the space before taking the seat across from him. No introduction. No formality. Just presence. You chose this place, Jonathan said, glancing briefly around. No menu, Emily replied. A faint recognition passed between them, the kind that did not need to be explained. A server approached, but Emily shook her head slightly. Just water, she said. Jonathan nodded. Same. When the server left, the silence returned, but this time it was different. Not uncertain. Not waiting. Ready. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, not to dominate the space, but to meet it. Why did you leave? He asked. No build-up. No strategy. Just the question that had followed him since the night before. Emily did not look away. I did not leave, she said. I stopped. Jonathan frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. There is a difference, she continued. Leaving implies something is behind you. Stopping means it is still there. It just does not define where you go next. Jonathan leaned back, absorbing that, recognizing the precision in her words, the same precision that had changed the outcome of a deal in a single sentence. And now, he asked. Emily traced the rim of her glass lightly, not distracted, just grounding the moment. Now I choose when to use what I know, she said. Not because someone expects it. Not because it is valuable. Because it matters. Jonathan nodded slowly. That was the part he had missed. Not her knowledge. Her control over it. He looked at her for a moment, not analyzing, not measuring, just seeing. Then let me ask you something differently, he said. Not as a job. Not as an offer. He paused. What would make it matter for you? The question settled between them, quiet, but heavier than anything else he had said. Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at him, really looked this time, past the name, past the reputation, into the space where intention lived. Then she spoke. Respect, she said. Not for what I can do. For what I choose not to do. Jonathan held her gaze, and for the first time, there was no instinct to respond quickly, no need to control the direction. Just understanding. He nodded once. That is fair, he said. Not as a negotiation. As acceptance. Outside, the city continued. Cars passing, lights shifting, people moving through their own stories without noticing this one. Inside, nothing dramatic happened. No contract was signed. No agreement was made. But something quieter took place. Something that did not need witnesses. Two people sat across from each other, not as roles, not as positions, but as individuals who understood something the room the night before had not. Value is easy to recognize, but respect has to be earned in silence. And that night, neither of them spoke to impress. They spoke to understand. And that changed everything.